The morning mist clung to the pine trees of northern Arizona like a shroud, but Jake Morrison could smell something different in the air. 20 years of working these forests had taught him to read the wind, and today it carried the acrid scent of burning wood that wasn't from any campfire or controlled burn. Jake paused, his weathered axe suspended mid-swing against the towering ponderosa pine. Sweat beaded on his sun-damaged forehead, despite the cool October morning air that bit at his exposed skin. At 42, his broad shoulders still carried the strength of 2 decades spent felling trees in some of Arizona's most remote wilderness areas, but his gray eyes had gained a wisdom that came with solitude and hard-earned experience in these unforgiving mountains. The smoke grew thicker with each passing minute, and Jake's survival instincts kicked in like a switch being flipped. He dropped his tools without a second thought and grabbed his water canteen, following the increasingly strong scent through the dense undergrowth that had grown wild after years without human interference. His heavy leather boots crunched through layers of fallen leaves as he navigated between the massive tree trunks, his heart rate quickening with each step that brought him closer to whatever disaster awaited. The forest around him seemed unusually quiet, as if the wildlife had already fled from whatever danger lay ahead. Even the birds had stopped their morning songs, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the distant crackling that grew louder as he pressed forward through the wilderness that had been his home and workplace for so many years. As he crested a small ridge overlooking a hidden valley he'd never explored, Jake saw it. A modest log cabin completely engulfed in flames, the orange and red tongues licking hungrily at the wooden structure while black smoke billowed into the gray morning sky. But what made his blood run cold and sent adrenaline surging through his veins was the sound. A woman's voice calling desperately for help from somewhere inside the burning building. Without hesitation or thought for his own safety, Jake sprinted down the slope, his logger's strength and years of navigating difficult terrain propelling him forward faster than he'd moved in years. The heat hit him like an oppressive wall as he approached the cabin, but through the smoke and flames, he could see movement through one of the windows. Someone was definitely trapped inside, and from the intensity of the fire, time was running out fast. Jake pulled his thick flannel shirt up over his nose and mouth, trying desperately to filter the acrid smoke that burned his lungs and made his eyes water uncontrollably. The front door was completely blocked by fallen debris and burning timber, but a side window remained partially clear of flames, though smoke poured from it in thick, choking clouds. Using the handle of his axe like a battering ram, he smashed through the glass and wooden frame, clearing away the sharp edges with his gloved hands before hauling himself through the opening. The interior was a hellish maze of smoke and falling embers, with the temperature so intense it felt like stepping into an oven. Jake's eyes watered as he squinted through the haze, following the sound of desperate coughing toward the back of the single-room cabin. There, huddled in the farthest corner, with a wet blanket pulled over her head and shoulders, was a young Native American woman, probably in her mid-20s. Her long black hair was singed at the edges, and her clothes were torn and blackened with soot. But she was conscious and alert despite the life-threatening situation surrounding them both. "I've got you," Jake shouted over the roar of the flames that seemed to be consuming everything around them, reaching for her trembling hand. Her dark eyes met his through the thick smoke, eyes filled with fear, but also a fierce determination to survive that impressed him even in these desperate circumstances. She was struggling to breathe in the toxic air, but was clearly fighting to stay conscious. The woman pointed urgently toward a small wooden box sitting on a nearby shelf that hadn't yet caught fire, shouting something in what Jake immediately recognized as Apache, though he couldn't understand the specific words. Her urgency was unmistakable, and Jake could see that whatever was in that box was important enough to risk her life for. Without questioning her judgment, he grabbed both the ornate wooden container and the woman herself, lifting her into his arms with the strength born of years of hard physical labor. The cabin's main support beams groaned ominously above them, and Jake knew they had only seconds before the entire structure would collapse. He managed to help the woman through the window first, practically throwing her to safety, then followed just as the cabin's roof caved in with a thunderous crash that sent sparks and burning debris spiraling high into the gray morning sky. Both of them collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping desperately for clean air while their smoke-damaged lungs burned with each breath. The woman clutched the wooden box protectively to her chest, her breathing gradually steadying as she watched what had obviously been her home for many years reduced to nothing more than ash, ember, and twisted metal in a matter of minutes. Jake sat up slowly on the pine needle-covered ground, methodically checking himself for serious injuries before turning his attention to the woman he'd just pulled from what could easily have been her funeral pyre. She was carefully examining the wooden box with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline and shock, her long black hair tangled with ash and small pieces of debris from their harrowing escape. Despite the trauma she'd just endured and the complete destruction of her home, there was something remarkably serene and composed about her presence that Jake found oddly comforting in the aftermath of such chaos and destruction. "Are you hurt anywhere?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse and raspy from the smoke he'd inhaled during the rescue. The woman looked up at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul, and for the first time since pulling her from the flames, he could see her clearly in the morning light. She had strong, beautifully defined features and skin weathered by years of sun and wind, but her dark eyes held a gentleness and wisdom that seemed to contradict the harsh environment she obviously called home. "No serious injuries, thanks to your courage," she replied in clear, articulate English, though her accent carried the melodic, distinctive cadence of her native Apache language. "You risked your life for a complete stranger." She gestured reverently to the carved wooden box in her hands. "This belonged to my grandmother and her grandmother before her. It contains medicinal herbs and healing knowledge that has been passed down through generations of my family. I couldn't leave without it, even if it meant dying in the flames." Jake nodded with immediate understanding. In his many years alone in the forest, living simply and relying on his own skills and resources, he'd learned to respect the deep, almost spiritual connections people formed with meaningful objects that represented their heritage and identity. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, extending a soot-covered hand. "I work timber claims about 2 miles north of here, been in these mountains for the better part of 20 years. "I'm Ayana," she replied, accepting his handshake with a grip that was surprisingly strong and confident. Jake somehow sensed that her name meant something like Eternal Blossom in Apache, though he couldn't say how he knew this. "I've actually seen you working in the forest before, though you probably never noticed me. I spent most of my time gathering medicinal plants and herbs in these woods, following the old ways my grandmother taught me." As they sat together watching the smoldering remains of her cabin send smoke signals into the increasingly cloudy sky, Jake felt an unexpected and powerful sense of responsibility settling over him like a heavy blanket. This woman had lost everything she owned in the world, and something deep inside his chest told him he couldn't just walk away and leave her to face this disaster alone. The autumn air was already getting noticeably colder as clouds gathered overhead, and winter in northern Arizona could be absolutely brutal for anyone caught unprepared and without proper shelter. "You can't stay out here exposed to the elements," Jake said finally, his practical nature taking over. "My cabin isn't luxurious by any means, but it's solid, warm, and completely weatherproof. You're welcome to stay there until you can figure out what to do next and where you want to go." Ayana studied his weathered face for a long, contemplative moment, as if reading something written in the lines and scars there that even Jake himself didn't know existed. Her gaze seemed to pierce right through his usual defenses and see the man underneath the gruff exterior he developed during his years of solitude. Then she nodded slowly, with a dignity that impressed him. "I accept your kindness, Jake Morrison," she said simply, "and I promise I won't be a burden to you." Jake's cabin sat in a clearing he'd carved out of the wilderness with his own hands, spartanly furnished but undeniably solid, built entirely from timber he'd personally harvested, cut, and shaped over the course of several years. As Ayana stepped across the threshold and into his private sanctuary, she immediately noticed how everything had its specific place and purpose, how even the simple furniture had been crafted with obvious care and meticulous attention to detail that spoke of a man who took pride in his work. "It feels peaceful here," she observed, running her fingers along the smooth, hand-polished surface of a dining table he'd made from a single piece of oak. "You built all of this yourself, didn't you?" "Had to," Jake replied, moving to stir the bank coals in his stone fireplace back to life. When you live this far from civilization, you learn to make do with whatever materials you can find and rely on your own skills. There's no hardware store or lumber yard when you need to fix something out here. He paused, suddenly feeling self-conscious about his modest dwelling. It's probably not much compared to what you're used to living in. Ayanna shook her head emphatically. My cabin was simple too, built in the traditional way with materials from the forest. I believe in living in harmony with what the earth provides rather than taking more than you need. She carefully opened her precious medicine box and began systematically examining its contents with the careful attention of someone checking for damage to priceless artifacts. Many of the smaller containers and pouches had been sealed well enough to protect the delicate herbs inside from smoke damage, which seemed to bring her considerable relief. Over the next several days, an unexpected but surprisingly comfortable routine began to develop between them. Jake would head out each morning to work his various timber claims, marking trees for harvest and maintaining the equipment he used to process the wood, while Ayanna explored the surrounding forest with the keen eye of someone trained from childhood to recognize valuable plants. She proved remarkably adept at finding food sources Jake had walked past for 20 years without ever noticing. Edible roots, medicinal plants, and natural resources that revealed ways to read and understand the forest that went far beyond his purely practical knowledge. In the evenings, they would sit by the crackling fire, and Ayanna would share stories of her grandmother's teachings, passed down through oral tradition over countless generations. She explained in fascinating detail how different combinations of plants could heal various ailments, how to read weather patterns days in advance by observing the behavior of animals and birds, and most importantly, how to move through the wilderness with minimal impact on the delicate ecosystem that sustained all life in the region. The old ways teach that you take only what you truly need from the forest, she explained one evening, while grinding dried herbs with a smooth stone pestle her grandmother had given her years before. And you always give something back in return, whether it's seeds for new growth or simply your respect and gratitude. The forest provides generously for those who understand how to respect its rhythms and cycles. Jake found himself completely fascinated by the depth and complexity of her knowledge, slowly realizing how much he'd been missing despite his 2 decades of experience in these same wilderness areas. As October gradually deepened into November, and the first hints of winter began to appear in the shortening days and increasingly cold nights, Jake began to see the familiar forest through Ayanna's completely different perspective. She patiently taught him to identify dozens of plants he'd walked past literally thousands of times without ever noticing. Wild mint that grew in shaded creek beds and could solve digestive problems. Willow bark that could be harvested sustainably and processed into a natural pain reliever more effective than anything available in town. And dozens of other valuable species that grew abundantly in their remote corner of Arizona. Your people have forgotten so much of the old knowledge, Ayanna said one crisp morning as they walked together through a grove of aspen trees whose golden leaves created a brilliant canopy of light above their heads. You see the forest primarily as something to use and harvest, but not as something that can teach you about life itself if you're willing to listen carefully. Jake bristled slightly at first, his pride stung by what sounded like criticism of his life's work. But her words weren't spoken with any judgment or condescension, just thoughtful observation based on years of experience. I've made my entire living from these trees for 20 years, he said, gesturing toward the towering pines around them. But I've always tried to be responsible and sustainable about how I harvest them. I know that about you, Ayanna replied, placing her hand gently on the deeply furrowed bark of a massive ponderosa pine that had probably been growing for over a century. I've watched you work from a distance many times over the years. You don't take more trees than you actually need, and you always replant new seedlings in areas where you've harvested. But there's so much more the forest can teach about the interconnectedness of all living things, if you're willing to listen with your heart as well as your mind. She began showing him how to identify the age and health of trees, not just by their size and obvious characteristics, but by reading the subtle stories told in the patterns of their bark, the way their branches grew, and how they interacted with the plants and animals around them. She taught him to predict weather changes days in advance by carefully watching the behavior of birds, small mammals, and even insects. Most importantly, she showed him how to move through the wilderness almost silently, stepping lightly, and leaving virtually no trace of his passage. In return, Jake eagerly shared his own hard-won practical skills: how to repair essential tools, using only improvised materials found in the forest, how to build structures that could withstand the harsh weather conditions common in the region, and how to work efficiently with limited resources while still maintaining high standards of craftsmanship. Their different types of knowledge began to complement each other in ways neither of them had expected when this unlikely partnership first began. One evening, as they prepared a dinner of wild greens Ayanna had gathered and a rabbit Jake had caught in one of his traps, she looked across the dancing flames at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, but found deeply moving. "You saved more than just my life that day," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "You saved my grandmother's knowledge and the wisdom of countless generations. Without that medicine box, healing traditions that took centuries to develop would have been lost forever." Jake felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, a warmth and connection that had absolutely nothing to do with the fire crackling between them. The first real test of their developing partnership came in late November, when Jake suddenly developed a severe respiratory infection that seemed to worsen with each passing day. The smoke he'd inhaled during the dramatic cabin rescue had apparently damaged his lungs more seriously than either of them had initially realized, and the increasingly cold, dry mountain air was making it progressively more difficult for him to breathe normally. "You need to see a proper doctor in town immediately," Ayanna insisted with obvious concern as Jake struggled through another violent coughing fit that left him exhausted, wheezing, and barely able to catch his breath. "The nearest doctor is more than 40 miles away," Jake gasped, his face flushed with fever and exertion. "And with this weather system moving in, the mountain roads are probably already impassable for any vehicle." For 3 consecutive days, a fierce winter storm had been battering their isolated area, dropping nearly 3 feet of heavy snow and creating wind conditions that made travel dangerous even for someone in perfect health and with proper equipment. Jake's condition was clearly deteriorating, and they both knew that without medical intervention, the situation could become life-threatening very quickly. Ayanna opened her precious medicine box with steady, confident hands and began preparing a complex treatment that Jake would never have believed could be effective. She carefully brewed a healing tea from pine needles and wild cherry bark, created an intensive steam treatment using herbs that seemed to open his constricted airways almost immediately, and prepared poultices that appeared to draw the dangerous inflammation directly from his chest and throat. "My grandmother successfully treated Spanish flu victims with these same traditional medicines," she explained calmly as she worked with the focused concentration of a trained healer. "Long before there were hospitals or modern medical facilities anywhere in this part of the country, people survived serious illnesses using only what the natural world provided." For 2 full days and nights, Ayanna barely left Jake's bedside. She constantly monitored his breathing and temperature, carefully adjusted his treatments based on his body's responses, and fed him healing teas at precisely timed intervals. Slowly but unmistakably, Jake began to show signs of improvement. By the end of that challenging week, he was breathing clearly and easily for the first time since the rescue. As he sat up in bed for the first time in days, looking at Ayanna's concerned but relieved face, Jake realized something profound and life-changing had happened between them during those critical days. She hadn't just healed his damaged body. She'd demonstrated a depth of caring and commitment he hadn't experienced from another human being in more years than he could remember. "You could have left me here and gone to find help," he said quietly, his voice still rough, but much stronger. "You could have tried to reach your own people or found some other place to stay where you'd be safer." Ayanna smiled with a warmth that made Jake's heart skip several beats. "This is where I belong now," she said with simple, unshakable certainty. Winter settled over northern Arizona with unusual severity that year, bringing record snowfalls and temperatures that regularly dropped well below zero, effectively trapping Jake and Ayanna in their isolated valley for weeks at a time. Rather than feeling confined or restless, They both discovered a deep contentment and sense of completeness neither had experienced before in their previously solitary lives. Their daily routines became seamlessly integrated in ways that felt completely natural. Jake would maintain their cabin and all their essential equipment, while Ayanna skillfully managed their food stores and continued preparing the various medicines they might need to survive the harsh winter months. In the long evenings, they would share personal stories and experiences, with Jake talking about his years of deliberately chosen solitude and the events that had driven him to seek isolation, while Ayanna shared the rich oral traditions that had been passed down through her family for countless generations. What made you choose to live alone out here, so far from other people? Ayanna asked one particularly cold night as they watched heavy snow falling steadily outside their frost-covered window. Jake was quiet for a long time, staring thoughtfully into the hypnotic flames of their fire. After my father died unexpectedly, I inherited his logging business back in town, he finally said. But I couldn't handle the constant politics, the cutthroat competition, and especially the way some people treated the forest like it was just another resource to be conquered and exploited without any regard for the consequences. So I came out here where I could work at my own pace, according to my own values, without having to compromise my principles. And you've been completely alone all these years, never wanted companionship. Until now, Jake said, meeting her eyes directly across the flickering firelight with an honesty that surprised them both. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to address directly or completely. But the understanding was definitely there. They had become absolutely essential to each other in ways that went far beyond their practical partnership and shared survival needs. Ayanna had begun incorporating Jake's efficiency and systematic planning skills into her own traditional practices, while Jake found himself approaching his timber work with the deep reverence and spiritual respect she had taught him. Together, they were creating something entirely new, a way of living that honored both practical necessity and spiritual connection to the natural world that sustained them. As winter deepened and the snow continued to accumulate around their warm, secure cabin, they gradually realized they were no longer just two people sharing shelter out of convenience and necessity. They had become a true team, each partner making the other stronger, more complete, and more capable than either could have been alone. Spring arrived early that year, melting the accumulated snow in rushing streams and creeks that filled their entire valley with the constant, joyful sound of renewal and rebirth. Jake and Ayanna stood together on the ridge where her burned cabin had once sat, looking out over the vast forest that had brought them together in such dramatic and unexpected circumstances. "I've been thinking seriously about something," Jake said, his calloused, work-hardened hand finding hers and holding it gently. "About building something completely new here. Not just another simple cabin, but a real place where we could share everything we've learned together. Your grandmother's irreplaceable medicine knowledge, sustainable forestry practices, and most importantly, how to live in true harmony with the natural world." Ayanna squeezed his hand tightly, her dark eyes bright with excitement and infinite possibility. A place where both ways of understanding the world could not just coexist, but actually make each other stronger? "Exactly," Jake said, turning to face her completely. "I know it won't be easy, and there will definitely be challenges we haven't even thought of yet. People in town might not understand what we're trying to accomplish, and we'll have to figure out how to make it financially sustainable. But I truly believe we could make a real, lasting difference in how people think about their relationship with the environment." Over the long winter months they'd spent isolated together, they had gradually refined and integrated their combined knowledge into something genuinely unprecedented. Jake's practical skills in construction, resource management, and efficient work methods, combined with Ayanna's profound understanding of the forest's natural cycles, medicinal plants, and traditional ecological wisdom, had created entirely new approaches to wilderness living that were both environmentally sustainable and economically viable. "My grandmother always told me that knowledge grows strongest and most useful when it's shared freely between different peoples and cultures," Ayanna said thoughtfully. "She would definitely approve of this path we're choosing together." As they walked hand in hand back toward the cabin that had sheltered and protected them through the challenging winter, they began making concrete, detailed plans for their shared future. They would expand Jake's existing property, creating adequate space for visitors who wanted to learn traditional skills alongside modern sustainable practices. Ayanna would teach plant identification, natural healing methods, and the spiritual aspects of living in harmony with nature, while Jake would share responsible forestry techniques, wilderness construction skills, and practical resource management. Standing together in the doorway of the cabin that had become so much more than just shelter. It had become their first real home together. Jake realized that the devastating fire that had initially brought them together had actually burned away much more than just Ayanna's old dwelling. It had cleared space in both their lives for something entirely new and infinitely better. A true partnership that honored and celebrated both of their different backgrounds, while creating possibilities that neither could have achieved alone. "So we build this dream together?" Jake asked, though he could already see the answer shining in her beautiful smile. "Together," Ayanna confirmed with absolute certainty, and Jake knew beyond any doubt that their real journey through life was just beginning. The forest around them seemed to hum with approval and anticipation, the warm spring wind carrying the sweet scent of new growth and infinite possibility through the ancient pine trees that had silently witnessed their remarkable transformation from strangers to partners to something much deeper. Two people who had found in each other not just love, but a shared purpose that would honor both their individual traditions while building something completely new and wonderful for the future.